Perfectionism describes a pattern where self-worth becomes tied to flawless performance, and any gap between the work and the ideal registers not as ordinary imperfection, but as a personal failing. It isn't the same as having high standards. Healthy high standards feel motivating, they pull you toward something. Perfectionism feels like pressure from behind, pushing you away from something. Criticism, disapproval, the sense of not being enough. What separates perfectionism from ordinary care about your work is the emotional weight attached to falling short. Most people can submit a solid piece of work and move on. Someone with high perfectionism might spend hours after submitting it, replaying every sentence, certain that the one small flaw is the only thing anyone will notice. This isn't about wanting to do well. Wanting to do well is completely normal. Perfectionism is what happens when doing well stops being enough, and only flawless will do. And even then, only briefly, before the bar quietly moves again. Because perfectionism often produces genuinely good, careful work, it's frequently praised rather than questioned by managers, by teachers, by the person experiencing it. They're just thorough. They hold themselves to a high standard. From the outside, it can look indistinguishable from healthy conscientiousness, which is exactly why it so rarely gets challenged, even when it's quietly exhausting the person underneath it. But the difference shows up in how it feels, not how it looks. Diligence feels effortful but sustainable, a satisfying kind of tired at the end. Perfectionism feels like relief is always just out of reach, because there is always one more thing that could be improved, checked again, worded slightly better. For many people, this pattern was shaped early, in environments where approval or safety was tied closely to getting things right. A household, a school, a sport, where mistakes carried real consequences rather than being treated as an ordinary part of learning. Once that link is built, the brain doesn't distinguish between a genuinely high-stakes mistake and an ordinary, low-stakes one. It treats both the same way, as something to be prevented at all costs. Recent research reviews describe perfectionism as keeping the nervous system in a near-constant state of low-grade threat detection, scanning for what could go wrong, what could still be improved, what a critic might notice. This isn't a metaphor. The same physiological systems that respond to genuine danger, a racing heart, a tight chest, a mind that won't settle, activate in response to an unfinished task or an email that hasn't been reread enough times yet. This explains why good enough can feel less like relief and more like exposure. If effort has always been the thing standing between you and disaster, then stopping before everything feels airtight can genuinely register as unsafe, not just uncomfortable. The body isn't being dramatic, it's running its oldest threat response for a target that was never actually life-threatening in the first place. This also explains why logic alone rarely resolves it. Telling yourself, "It's fine, nobody will notice," rarely lands when the body is already flooded with stress signals, treating the situation as urgent. This is part of why perfectionism responds better, over time, to small, lived experiments. Finishing something at 70% and noticing that nothing bad actually happens, than to reasoning your way out of the feeling in the moment. One of the most common and damaging assumptions about perfectionism is that it reflects arrogance or an inflated need to be the best. Research points in a different direction. Perfectionism is strongly linked to environments where love, attention, or safety felt conditional on achievement or correctness, meaning it was shaped by circumstance, not by an inherent character trait needing correction. A growing body of 2026 research also links rising perfectionism directly to anxiety, depression, and burnout, particularly among younger people navigating intense academic and social pressure. This isn't a personal weakness showing up more often, It's a rational, if costly, adaptation to genuinely demanding conditions. A mind doing its best to stay safe in an environment where mistakes felt like they mattered enormously. Naming this doesn't excuse away the real difficulties perfectionism creates in daily life. The procrastination, the exhaustion, the difficulty resting, all covered later in this series. But it does remove an unhelpful layer of shame, because a large part of what makes perfectionism so hard to shift is the belief that struggling with it means something is wrong with your character, rather than with a pattern you learned. Left unexamined, perfectionism rarely stays contained to single tasks. It shapes decisions long before any work has even begun. The project left unstarted because starting badly feels worse than not starting. The opinion softened into agreement because a strong stance might turn out to be wrong. The rest that never quite gets taken because there's always one more thing that could be improved first. Over time, this can quietly narrow a life in ways that rarely look dramatic from the outside. Fewer risks taken, fewer finished projects shared, more energy spent managing the gap between the work and some imagined ideal than actually living with the work as it is. All or nothing thinking often travels alongside it. One missed day, one imperfect attempt, treated as proof the whole effort has failed, rather than as one ordinary setback among many. It also shapes relationships, sometimes in confusing ways, for both people involved. A partner or colleague might experience the person with high perfectionism as anxious, rigid, or hard to please, not because they're being unreasonable, but because their nervous system is responding to a felt sense of risk that isn't visible from the outside. And underneath much of it sits a particularly stubborn problem, a mind that struggles to recognize rest as safe, because rest has never felt like something you're allowed until everything is finished, and nothing ever quite is. The encouraging part, and the through line of this entire series, is that this pattern was learned under specific conditions, which means it can be reshaped under different ones. Not by trying to care less about your work, but by building enough real, repeated evidence that good enough is genuinely survivable. This video has focused on definition and recognition, what perfectionism actually is, why it gets mistaken for ambition, and why it reflects a learned nervous system pattern rather than a personal flaw. The remaining 2 long-form videos this week build directly on this foundation. On Wednesday, we look at how perfectionism quietly runs work, relationships, and rest through specific patterns: procrastination, over-preparing, all-or-nothing thinking, and its close link to burnout. On Friday, we close the series by moving from understanding into practice, concrete, realistic steps for choosing progress over perfect. If anything in this video has resonated, that reaction is itself meaningful information, worth trusting rather than explaining away. This week on Healing Through Thoughts, we're naming this pattern clearly, without shame, and then getting to work on it together.